friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day one of our read-along together of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. It's a fun new book. I've mentioned this a little bit in our past reading, or the last couple days when we were kind of leading up to this one, and I just want to say, if you've already read Wuthering Heights, you know how weird and great and wonderful this book is. If you've not read Wuthering Heights, let me just tell you, you're in for a really fun ride. Wuthering Heights is a classic of English literature. It was published in 1847 by Emily Brontë, and just giving a little bit of history of the Brontes because I kind of love them. The Brontë family, they were, there were three writers in the family. There were actually 6 kids of, I can't remember what the father's name was, but Mr. Brontë was a priest. Curate? He had a parish. He was at Haworth Parish. That one I know. And he had the 2 oldest kids died of illness. And so the kids that survived to adulthood were Charlotte Brontë, who later on became the author of Jane Eyre. The next child was Branwell Brontë, who was a painter, poet, tried to be a lot of things, never really lived up to his potential, ended up drinking himself to death. Then the next child was Emily Brontë, who wrote one book, Wuthering Heights, as well as some poems. And then Anne Brontë was the last child, and she wrote The Tenant of Wildefeld Hall, and I believe Agnes Grey is her other book. So, this is an incredibly talented family. They grew up in Yorkshire, which was considered the north and kind of like a wild, untamed area, which Emily Brontë was in particular fascinated with, and she writes about the moors, and they figure as a very important part of this book, Wuthering Heights. The 3 girls published their poems together. I believe it was 1846, and they published under gender-neutral, kind of male-sounding pseudonyms. So instead of Brontë, they published as Bell, and they used their first initials, but they disguised their names. So Charlotte became Kerr Bell, Emily became Ellis Bell, and Anne became Acton Bell. And so, the 3 sisters published this book of poetry, which did not do well. It sold a total of 2 copies. And so, but they decided that, they were still encouraged that they wanted to each write novels. So the 3 sisters then proceeded to each write a novel. And when those came out at around the same time, Charlotte had a huge bestseller success with Jane Eyre. Emily and Anne published Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights together in a 3-volume edition, with the first 2 volumes being Wuthering Heights and the last volume being Anne's Agnes Grey. And so Wuthering Heights was not nearly as well received initially as Jane Eyre. Y'all know I love Jane Eyre. But Wuthering Heights, it was seen as a bit more wild, if you will. There's less of a morality of a sense of like what's proper, and there's just passion. Not just romantic, sexual passion, but just fierce passion for the soul, for the soil, for the land, for the environment, and yes, for another person. And it's a very emotional story. And because it was seen as, it must have been written by a man, because it was so unwomanly, or considered to be so, because it was just so emotional and so raw. In the years since Emily's death, she did die just 1 year after the publication of the book. She died of tuberculosis in 1848. Anne died Bramwell died like 3 months before she did, and then Emily died, and then I think Anne died a year or so after that, and then Charlotte died a few years afterwards. So they all had short lives, but they were incredibly talented, the Brontes. And so, yeah, if you do get a chance to read some Brontë books later on, I can post some links to some books. And I was quite intrigued by the film that came out a couple years ago. It showed on PBS, and I believe it's called To Walk Invisible. And it was a film about the Brontes, especially covering the last years of their lives, leading up to the publication of their books together. And so I'll go ahead and post a link to that too, because it's in the library collection and it's wonderful. But so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights has since been adapted many times. It's become a very, very well-esteemed book, and many critics consider it to be, there's back and forth as to, it's interesting, when you have a very talented family, there can be conflict as to whether, who's the more talented of the family. And so you've got some folks who say it's Charlotte Brontë with her classic Jane Eyre, others saying it is Emily Brontë with her classic Wuthering Heights. we've mentioned this before. I'd be curious to know, for those of you who have read both of the books, if you have a preference, if you have, or as you're going along with them. It's just kind of fun to compare, isn't it? I love them both. I've always been a fan more of Jane Eyre over Wuthering Heights, just because I like that story of like the growth of the girl, that special, that kind of like spunky little underdog. But there's something about Wuthering Heights. It's so different from other stories. I mean, it has such an energy to it. And I think it's like that rawness that was seen as savage is just so pure. And it's like, it's elemental is how a lot of folks will describe it too. I hope you enjoy it. It's one of those stories that because I was a Jane Eyre fan first, and that's why I then picked up Wuthering Heights. I remember when I read it, I was like, it's so different. It's not my cup of tea. But when I read it again when I was a few years older, and it's just like, it's such a powerful book. It's so moving. And it's one of those ones, it just draws you in. It is so emotional. So I hope you enjoy the book. I'm going to apologize in advance for my many, many, many times I'm going to butcher the accent. I do not know the Yorkshire accent, and I will do my best to just sort of do something. But apologies for not being geographically accurate, nor historically so. But yeah, I hope you enjoy the book. It is so much fun. Okay, so the tea I'm having today is a loose leaf black tea. It's actually a Blue Lady Grey, because I thought, again, I was thinking about the moors and just having like how they have like the heather like growing along the fields, and I thought something kind of blue purpley would felt right. Okay, let's go ahead and start Wuthering Heights. I'm actually going to begin, instead of with the actual book, we're going to start out with a preface that was published in 1850. What I find interesting about it, so the book originally came out in 1847. By 1850, it was the second edition of Wuthering Heights. And again, mind you, the first book had not been hugely popular, but I think, I could do a little more research, but I suspect that part of the reason it got a second printing was, yes, there were fans of the book, but also because of the popularity of Jane Eyre. Like, Jane Eyre was hugely popular. By this point in 1850, Emily Brontë had been dead for 2 years, and her sister Charlotte Brontë actually writes the preface to the book. And what I also found fascinating is that she signs that preface as Currer Bell. So she's still using her androgynous, male-sounding pseudonym, but she does refer to the author, Ellis Bell, as her sister. So it's kind of an interesting moment in time where she's sort of acknowledging their real identities, but also working under the pseudonyms that they originally published the books by. So for today, we're just going to read the preface and the first 2 chapters. So let's begin with the editor's preface to the new edition of Wuthering Heights, which came out in 1850. I have just read over Wuthering Heights, and for the first time have obtained a clear glimpse of what are termed, and perhaps really are, its faults, have gained a definite notion of how it appears to other people, to strangers who knew nothing of the author, who are unacquainted with the locality where the scenes of the story are laid, to whom the inhabitants, the customs, the natural characteristics of the outlying hills and hamlets in the West Riding of Yorkshire are things alien and unfamiliar. To all such, Wuthering Heights must appear a rude and strange production. The wild moors of the north of England can for them have no interest. The language, the manners, the very dwellings and house... Sorry, my connection cut out from... I'm going to go back to the start of that paragraph. To all such, Wuthering Heights must appear a rude and strange production. The wild moors of the north of England can for them have no interest. The language, the manners, the very dwellings and household customs of the scattered inhabitants of those districts must be to such readers in a great measure unintelligible, and, where intelligible, repulsive. Men and women who, perhaps, naturally very calm, and with feelings moderate in degree, and little marked in kind, have been trained from their cradle to observe the utmost evenness of manner and guardedness of language, will hardly know what to make of the rough, strong utterance, the harshly manifested passions, the unbridled aversions and headlong partialities of unlettered moorland hinds and rugged moorland squires, who have grown up untaught and unchecked, except by mentors as harsh as themselves. A large class of readers, likewise, will suffer greatly from the introduction into the pages of this work of words printed with all their letters, which it has become the custom to represent by the initial and final letter only, a blank line filling the interval. I may as well say at once that, for this circumstance, it is out of my power to apologize, deeming it myself a rational plan to write words at full length. The practice of hinting by single letters those expletives with which profane and violent people are wont to garnish their discourse strikes me as a proceeding which, however well meant, is weak and futile. I cannot tell what good it does, what feeling it spares, what horror it conceals. With regard to the rusticity of Wuthering Heights, I admit the charge, for I feel the quality. It is rustic all through. It is Moorish and wild and naughty as the root of heath. Nor was it natural that it should be otherwise, the author herself being a native and nursling of the moors. Doubtless, had her lot been cast in a town, her writings, if she had written at all, would have possessed another character. Even had chance or taste led her to choose a similar subject, she would have treated it otherwise. Had Ellis Bell been a lady or a gentleman accustomed to what is called the world, her view of a remote and unclaimed region, as well as of the dwellers therein, would have differed greatly from that actually taken by the homebred country girl. Doubtless, it would have been wider, more comprehensive. Whether it would have been more original or more truthful is not so certain. As far as the scenery and locality are concerned, it could scarcely have been so sympathetic. Ellis Bell did not describe as one whose eye and taste alone found pleasure in the prospect. Her native hills were far more to her than a spectacle. They were what she lived in and by, as much as the wild birds, their tenants, or as the heather, their produce. Her descriptions, then, if natural scenery, are what they should be, and all they should be. Where delineation of human character is concerned, the case is different. I am bound to avow that she had scarcely more practical knowledge of the peasantry amongst whom she lived than a nun has of the country people who sometimes pass her convent gates. My sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favored and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Except to go to church or take a walk on the hills, she rarely crossed the threshold of home. Though her feeling for the people round was benevolent, intercourse with them she never sought, nor, with very few exceptions, ever experienced. And yet she knew them, knew their ways, their language, their family histories. She could hear of them with interest and talk of them with detail, minute, graphic, and accurate. But with them, she rarely exchanged a word. Hence it ensued that what her mind had gathered of the real concerning them was too exclusively confined to those tragic and terrible traits of which, in listening to the secret annals of every rude vicinage, the memory is sometimes compelled to receive the impress. Her imagination, which was a spirit more somber than sunny, more powerful than sportive, found in such traits material whence it wrought creations like Heathcliff, like Earnshaw, like Catherine. Having formed these beings, she did not know what she had done. If the auditor of her work, when read in manuscript, shuddered under the grinding influence of natures so relentless and implacable, of spirits so lost and fallen, if it was complained that the mere hearing of certain vivid and fearful scenes banished sleep by night and disturbed mental peace by day, Ellis Bell would wonder what was meant and suspect the complainant of affectation. Had she but lived, her mind would of itself have grown like a strong tree, loftier, straighter, wider spreading, and its matured fruits would have attained a mellower ripeness and sunnier bloom. But on that mind time and experience alone could work. To the influence of other intellects, it was not amenable. Having avowed that over much of Wuthering Heights there broods a horror of great darkness, that in its storm-heated and electrical atmosphere we seem at times to breathe lightning, let me point to those spots where clouded daylight and the eclipsed sun still attest their existence. For a specimen of true benevolence and homely fidelity, look at the character of Nellie Dean. For an example of constancy and tenderness, remark that of Edgar Linton. Some people will think these qualities do not shine so well incarnate in a man as they would do in a woman, but Ellis Bell could never be brought to comprehend this notion. Nothing moved her more than any insinuation that the faithfulness and clemency, the long-suffering and loving-kindness which are esteemed virtues in the daughters of Eve, become foibles in the sons of Adam. She held that mercy and forgiveness are the divinest attributes of the great being who made both man and woman, and that what clothes the Godhead in glory can disgrace no form of feeble humanity. There is a dry, saturnine humor in the delineation of old Joseph, and some glimpses of grace and gaiety animate the younger Catherine. Nor is even the first heroine of the name destitute of a certain strange beauty in her fierceness, or of honesty in the midst of perverted passion and passionate perversity. Heathcliff indeed stands unredeemed, never once swerving in his arrow-straight course to perdition, from the time when the little black-haired, swarthy thing, as dark as if it came from the devil, was first unrolled out of the bundle and set on its feet in the farmhouse kitchen, to the hour when Nellie Dean found the grim, stalwart corpse laid on its back in the panel-enclosed bed, with wide-gazing eyes that seemed to sneer at her attempt to close them, and parted lips and sharp white teeth that sneered too. Heathcliff betrays one solitary human feeling, and that is not his love for Catherine, which is a sentiment fierce and inhuman, a passion such as might boil and glow in the bad essence of some evil genius, a fire that might form the tormented center, the ever-suffering soul of a magnate of the infernal world, and by its quenchless and ceaseless ravage effect the execution of the decree which dooms him to carry hell with him wherever he wanders. No, the single link that connects Heathcliff with humanity is his rudely confessed regard for Hareton Earnshaw, the young man whom he has ruined, and then his half-implied esteem for Nellie Dean. These solitary traits omitted, we should say he was child neither of Lascar nor gypsy, but a man's shape animated by demon life, a ghoul and a freet. Whether it is right or advisable to create things like Heathcliff, I do not know. I scarcely think it is. But this I know. The writer who possesses the creative gift owns something of which he is not always master, something that at times strangely wills and works for itself. He may lay down rules and devise principles, and to rules and principles it will perhaps for years lie in subjection. And then, haply without any warning of revolt, there comes a time when it will no longer consent to harrow the valleys or be bound with a band in the furrow, when it laughs at the multitude of the city and regards not the crying of the driver, when, refusing absolutely to make ropes out of sea sand any longer, it sets to work on statue hewing, and you have a Pluto or a Jove, a Tisiphone or a Psyche, a mermaid or a Madonna, as fate or inspiration direct. Be the work grim or glorious, dread or divine, you have little choice but quiescent adoption. As for you, the nominal artist, your share in it has been to work passively under dictates you neither delivered nor could question, that would not be uttered at your prayer, nor suppressed, nor changed at your caprice. If the result be attractive, the world will praise you, who little deserve praise. If it be repulsive, the same world will blame you, who almost as little deserve blame. Wuthering Heights was hewn in a wild workshop with simple tools out of homely materials. The statuary found a granite block on a solitary moor. Gazing thereon, he saw how from the crag might be elicited the head, savage, swart, sinister, a form molded with at least one element of grandeur, power. He wrought with a rude chisel, and from no model but the vision of his meditations. With time and labor, the crag took human shape, and there it stands colossal, dark, and frowning, half statue, half rock. In the former sense, terrible and goblin-like. In the latter, almost beautiful, for its coloring is of mellow gray, and moorland moss clothes it. And heath, with its blooming bells and balmy fragrance, grows faithfully close to the giant's foot. Currer Bell. All right, that was the introduction by Charlotte Bell to her late sister's the second edition of Emily Bronte's book, Wuthering Heights. Now let's go ahead and read the first 2 chapters of Wuthering Heights. Chapter 1. 1801. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, the solitary neighbor that I shall be troubled with. This is certainly a beautiful country. In all England, I do not believe that I could have fixed on a situation so completely removed from the stir of society. A perfect misanthropist's heaven. And Mr. Heathcliff and I are such a suitable pair to divide the desolation between us. A capital fellow. He little imagined how my heart warmed towards him when I beheld his black eyes withdraw so suspiciously under their brows, as I rode up, and when his fingers sheltered themselves, with a jealous resolution still further in his waistcoat, as I announced my name. Mr. Heathcliff, I said. A nod was the answer. Mr. Lockwood, your new tenant, sir. I do myself the honor of calling as soon as possible after my arrival to express the hope that I have not inconvenienced you by my perseverance in soliciting the occupation of Thrushcross Grange. I heard yesterday you had had some thoughts. Thrushcross Grange is my own, sir, he interrupted, wincing. I should not allow anyone to inconvenience me if I could hinder it. Walk in. The walk in was uttered with closed teeth and expressed the sentiment, go to the devil. Even the gate over which he leant manifested no sympathizing movement to the words, and I think that circumstance determined me to accept the invitation. I felt interested in a man who seemed more exaggeratedly reserved than myself. When he saw my horse's breast fairly pushing the barrier, he did pull out his hand to unchain it, and then sullenly preceded me up the causeway, calling as we entered the court, Joseph, take Mr. Lockwood's horse and bring up some wine. Here we have the whole establishment of domestics, I suppose, was the reflection suggested by this compound order. No wonder the grass grows up between the flags and cattle are the only hedge cutters. Joseph was an elderly, nay, an old man. Very old, perhaps, though hale and sinewy. The Lord help us, he soliloquized in an undertone of peevish displeasure, while relieving me of my horse, looking meantime in my face so sourly that I charitably conjectured he must have need of divine aid to digest his dinner, and his pious ejaculation had no reference to my unexpected advent. Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering being a significant provincial adjective, descriptive of the atmospheric tumult to which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure, bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times, indeed. One may guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the end of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns all stretching their limbs one way as if craving alms of the sun. Happily, the architect had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large, jutting stones. Before passing the threshold, I paused to admire a quantity of grotesque carving lavished over the front, and especially about the principal door, above which, among the wilderness of crumbling griffins and shameless little boys, I detected the date 1500 and the name Hareton Earnshaw. I would have made a few comments and requested a short history of the place from the surly owner, but his attitude at the door appeared to demand my speedy entrance or complete departure, and I had no desire to aggravate his impatience previous to inspecting the penetralium. One step brought us into the family sitting room without any introductory lobby or passage. They call it here the house, preeminently. It includes kitchen and parlor generally, but I believe at Wuthering Heights the kitchen is forced to retreat altogether into another quarter. At least, I distinguished a chatter of tongues and a clatter of culinary utensils deep within, and I observed no signs of roasting, boiling, or baking about the huge fireplace, nor any glitter of copper saucepans and tin colanders on the walls. One end, indeed, reflected splendidly both light and heat from ranks of immense pewter dishes, interspersed with silver jugs and tankards, towering row after row on a vast oak dresser to the very roof. The latter had never been underdrawn. Its entire anatomy lay bare to an inquiring eye, except where a frame of wood laden with oatcakes and clusters of legs of beef, mutton, and ham concealed it. Above the chimney were sundry villainous old guns and a couple of horse pistols, and by way of ornament, 3 gaudily painted canisters disposed along its ledge. The floor was of smooth white stone. The chairs, high-backed primitive structures, painted green. One or two heavy black ones lurking in the shade. In an arch under the dresser reposed a huge, liver-colored birch pointer, surrounded by a swarm of squealing puppies, and other dogs haunted other recesses. The apartment and furniture would have been nothing extraordinary as belonging to a homely northern farmer with a stubborn countenance and stalwart limbs set out to advantage in knee breeches and garter. Such an individual seated in his armchair, his mug of ale frothing on the round table before him, is to be seen in any circuit of 5 or 6 miles among these hills if you go at the right time after dinner. But Mr. Heathcliff forms a singular contrast to his abode and style of living. He is a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman. That is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire, rather slovenly perhaps, yet not looking amiss with his negligence, because he has an erect and handsome figure, and rather morose. Possibly some people might suspect him of a degree of underbred pride. I have a sympathetic chord within that tells me it is nothing of the sort. I know by instinct his reserve springs from an aversion to showy displays of feeling, to manifestations of mutual kindliness. He'll love and hate equally under cover, and esteem it a species of impertinence to be loved or hated again. No, I'm running on too fast. I bestow my own attributes over liberally on him. Mr. Heathcliff may have entirely dissimilar reasons for keeping his hand out of the way when he meets a would-be acquaintance, to those which actuate me. Let me hope my constitution is almost peculiar. My dear mother used to say I should never have a comfortable home, and only last summer I proved myself perfectly unworthy of one. While enjoying a month of fine weather at the seacoast, I was thrown into the company of a most fascinating creature, a real goddess in my eyes, as long as she took no notice of me. I never told my love vocally. Still, if looks have language, the merest idiot might have guessed I was over head and ears. She understood me at last, and looked a return, the sweetest of all imaginable looks. And what did I do? I confess it with shame, shrunk icily into myself like a snail. At every glance retired colder and farther, till finally the poor innocent was led to doubt her own senses, and, overwhelmed with confusion at her supposed mistake, persuaded her mamma to decamp. By this curious turn of disposition, I have gained the reputation of deliberate heartlessness. How undeserved, I alone can appreciate. I took a seat at the end of the hearthstone opposite that towards which my landlord advanced, and filled up an interval of silence by attempting to caress the canine mother, who had left her nursery and was sneaking wolfishly to the back of my legs, her lip curled up and her white teeth watering for a snatch. My caress provoked a long, guttural gnarl. "You'd better let the dog alone," growled Mr. Heathcliff in unison, checking fiercer demonstrations with a punch of his foot. "She's not accustomed to be spoiled, not kept for a pet." Then striding to a side door, he shouted again, "Joseph!" Joseph mumbled indistinctly in the depths of the cellar, but gave no intimation of ascending. So his master dived down to him, leaving me vis-a-vis the ruffianly bitch and a pair of grim, shaggy sheepdogs, who shared with her a jealous guardianship over all my movements. Not anxious to come in contact with their fangs, I sat still. But imagining they would scarcely understand tacit insults, I unfortunately indulged in winking and making faces at the trio, and some turn of my physiognomy so irritated Madame that she suddenly broke into a fury and leapt on my knees. I flung her back and hastened to interpose the table between us. This proceeding roused the whole hive. 6 4-footed fiends of various sizes and ages issued from hidden dens to the common center. I felt my heels and coat laps peculiar subjects of assault, and, pairing off the larger combatants as effectually as I could with the poker, I was constrained to demand, aloud, assistance from some of the household in reestablishing peace. Mr. Heathcliff and his man climbed the cellar steps with vexatious phlegm. I don't think they moved 1 second faster than usual, though the hearth was an absolute tempest of worrying and yelping. Happily, an inhabitant of the kitchen made more dispatch. A lusty dame with tucked-up gown, bare arms, and fire-flushed cheeks rushed into the midst of us flourishing a frying-pan, and used that weapon and her tongue to such purpose that the storm subsided magically, and she only remained heaving like a sea after a high wind when her master entered on the scene. "What the devil is the matter?" he asked, eyeing me in a manner I could ill endure after this inhospitable treatment. "What the devil indeed," I muttered. "The herd of possessed swine could have had no worse spirits in them than those animals of yours, sir. You might as well leave a stranger with a brood of tigers." "They won't meddle with persons who touch nothing," he remarked, putting the bottle before me and restoring the displaced table. "The dogs do right to be vigilant. Take a glass of wine?" "No, thank you." "Not bitten, are you?" "If I had been, I would have set my signet on the biter." Heathcliff's countenance relaxed into a grin. "Come, come," he said. "You are flurried, Mr. Lockwood. Here, take a little wine. Guests are so exceedingly rare in this house that I and my dogs, I am willing to own, hardly know how to receive them. Your health, sir." I bowed and returned the pledge, beginning to perceive that it would be foolish to sit sulking for the misbehavior of a pack of curs. Besides, I felt loath to yield the fellow further amusement at my expense, since his humor took that turn. He, probably swayed by prudential considerations of the folly of offending a good tenant, relaxed a little in the laconic style of chipping off his pronouns and auxiliary verbs, and introduced what he supposed would be a subject of interest to me, a discourse on the advantages and disadvantages of my present place of retirement. I found him very intelligent on the topics we touched, and before I went home, I was encouraged so far as to volunteer another visit tomorrow. He evidently wished no repetition of my intrusion. I shall go notwithstanding. It is astonishing how sociable I feel myself compared with him. Chapter 2. Yesterday afternoon set in misty and cold. I had half a mind to spend it by my study fire, instead of wading through heath and mud to Wuthering Heights. On coming up from dinner, however, N.B., I dined between 12 and 1 o'clock. The housekeeper, a matronly lady, taken as a fixture along with the house, could not or would not comprehend my request that I might be served at 5. On mounting the stairs with this lazy intention and stepping into the room, I saw a servant girl on her knees, surrounded by brushes and coal scuttles, and raising an infernal dust as she extinguished the flames with heaps of cinders. This spectacle drove me back immediately. I took my hat, and, after a 4 miles walk, arrived at Heathcliff's garden gate just in time to escape the first feathery flakes of a snow shower. On that bleak hilltop, the earth was hard with a black frost, and the air made me shiver through every limb. Being unable to remove the chain, I jumped over, and, running up the flagged causeway bordered with straggling gooseberry bushes, knocked vainly for admittance till my knuckles tingled and the dogs howled. "Wretched inmates," I ejaculated mentally, "you deserve perpetual isolation from your species for your churlish inhospitality. At least I will not keep my doors barred in the daytime. I don't care. I will get in." So resolved, I grasped the latch and shook it vehemently. Vinegar-faced Joseph projected his head from a round window of the barn. "What are you for?" he shouted. "To master's down into fold. Go around by the end of the lath. If you want to speak to him, tell him." Oh my gosh. "Go around by then at lath. If you went to speak to him." "Is there nobody inside to open the door?" I hallooed responsively. "They's nubbut to missus, and she'll not open't, and you make your flaysome dins till neat." "Why, cannot you tell her who I am, Joseph?" "Nor na me. I'll not hand wit it," muttered the head, vanishing. The snow began to drive thickly. I seized the handle to essay another trial, when a young man, without coat and shouldering a pitchfork, appeared in the yard behind. He hailed me to follow him, and, after marching through a wash-house and a paved area containing a coal-shed, pump, and pigeon-cote, we at length arrived in the huge, warm, cheerful apartment where I was formerly received. It glowed delightfully in the radiance of an immense fire, compounded of coal, peat, and wood, and near the table, laid for a plentiful evening meal, I was pleased to observe the Mrs., an individual whose existence I had never previously suspected. I bowed and waited, thinking she would bid me take a seat. She looked at me, leaning back in her chair, and remained motionless and mute. "Rough weather," I remarked. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Heathcliff, the door must bear the consequence of your servants' leisure attendance. I had hard work to make them hear me." She never opened her mouth. I stared. She stared also. At any rate, she kept her eyes on me in a cool, regardless manner, exceedingly embarrassing and disagreeable. "Sit down," said the young man gruffly. "He'll be in soon." I obeyed, and hemmed, and called the villain Juno, who deigned at this second interview to move the extreme tip of her tail in token of owning my acquaintance. "A beautiful animal," I commenced again. "Do you intend parting with the little ones, madam?" "They are not mine," said the amiable hostess, more repellingly than Heathcliff himself could have replied. "Ah, your favorites are among these?" I continued, turning to an obscure cushion full of something like cats. "A strange choice of favorites," she observed scornfully. Unluckily, it was a heap of dead rabbits. I hemmed once more and drew closer to the hearth, repeating my comment on the wildness of the evening. "You should not have come out," she said, rising and reaching from the chimney-piece 2 of the painted canisters. Her position before was sheltered from the light. Now I had a distinct view of her whole figure and countenance. She was slender and apparently scarcely past girlhood. An admirable form, and the most exquisite little face that I have ever had the pleasure of beholding. Small features, very fair, flaxen ringlets, or rather golden, hanging loose on her delicate neck, and eyes, had they been agreeable in expression, they would have been irresistible. Fortunately, from my susceptible heart, the only sentiment they evinced hovered between scorn and a kind of desperation, singularly unnatural to be detected there. The canisters were almost out of her reach. I made a motion to aid her. She turned upon me as a miser might turn if anyone attempted to assist him in counting his gold. "I don't want your help," she snapped. "I can get them for myself." "I beg your pardon," I hastened to reply. "Were you asked to tea?" she demanded, tying an apron over her neat black frock and standing with a spoonful of the leaf poised over the pot. "I shall be glad to have a cup," I answered. "Were you asked?" she repeated. "No," I said, half smiling. "You are the proper person to ask me." She flung the tea back, spoon and all, and resumed her chair in a pet, her forehead corrugated and her red underlip pushed out like a child's, ready to cry. Meanwhile, the young man had slung onto his person a decidedly shabby upper garment, and, erecting himself before the blaze, looked down on me from the corner of his eyes, for all the world as if there were some mortal feud unavenged between us. I began to doubt whether he were a servant or not. His dress and speech were both rude, entirely devoid of the superiority observable in Mr. and Mrs. Heathcliff. His thick brown curls were rough and uncultivated. His whiskers encroached bearishly over his cheeks, and his hands were embrowned like those of the common laborer. Still, his bearing was free, almost haughty, and he showed none of a domestic's assiduity in attending on the lady of the house. In the absence of clear proofs of his condition, I deemed it best to abstain from noticing his curious conduct, and 5 minutes afterward, the entrance of Heathcliff relieved me, in some measure, from my uncomfortable state. "You see, sir, I am come, according to promise," I exclaimed, assuming the cheerful, "and I fear I shall be weather-bound for half an hour, if you can afford me shelter during that space." "Half an hour?" he said, shaking the white flakes from his clothes. "I wonder you should select the thick of a snowstorm to ramble about in. Do you know that you run a risk of being lost in the marshes? People familiar with these moors often miss their road on such evenings, and, I can tell you, there is no chance of a change at present. Perhaps I can get a guide among your lads, and he might stay at the Grange till morning. Could you spare me one?" No, I could not. "Oh, indeed. Well, then, I must trust to my own sagacity." Are you going to make the tea? Demanded he of the shabby coat, shifting his ferocious gaze from me to the young lady. Is he to have any? She asked, appealing to Heathcliff. Get it ready, will you? Was the answer, uttered so savagely that I started. The tone in which the words were said revealed a genuine bad nature. I no longer felt inclined to call Heathcliff a capital fellow. When the preparations were finished, he invited me with, Now, sir, bring forward your chair. And we all, including the rustic youth, drew round the table, an austere silence prevailing while we discussed our meal. I thought, if I had caused the cloud, it was my duty to make an effort to dispel it. They could not every day sit so grim and taciturn, and it was impossible, however ill-tempered they might be, that the universal scowl they wore was their everyday countenance. It is strange, I began, in the interval of swallowing one cup of tea and receiving another. It is strange how custom can mold our tastes and ideas. Many could not imagine the existence of happiness in a life of such complete exile from the world as you spend, Mr. Heathcliff. Yet I'll venture to say that, surrounded by your family, and with your amiable lady as the presiding genius over your home and heart— My amiable lady, he interrupted, with an almost diabolical sneer on his face. Where is she, my amiable lady? Mrs. Heathcliff, your wife, I mean. Well, yes. Oh, you would intimate that her spirit has taken the post of ministering angel and guards the fortunes of Wuthering Heights even when her body is gone. Is that it? Perceiving myself in a blunder, I attempted to correct it. I might have seen that there was too great a disparity between the ages of the parties to make it likely that they were man and wife. One was about 40, a period of mental vigor at which men seldom cherish the delusion of being married for love by girls. That dream is reserved for the solace of our declining years. The other did not look 17. Then it flashed upon me. The clown at my elbow, who was drinking his tea out of a basin and eating his bread with unwashed hands, may be her husband. Heathcliff Jr., of course. Here is the consequence of being buried alive. She has thrown herself away upon that boor from sheer ignorance that better individuals existed. A sad pity. I must beware how I cause her to regret her choice. The last reflection may seem conceited. It was not. My neighbor struck me as bordering on repulsive. I knew through experience that I was tolerably attractive. Mrs. Heathcliff is my daughter-in-law, said Heathcliff, corroborating my surmise. He turned as he spoke, a peculiar look in her direction, a look of hatred, unless he has a most perverse set of facial muscles that will not, like those of other people, interpret the language of his soul. Ah, certainly, I see now. You are the favored possessor of the beneficent fairy, I remarked, turning to my neighbor. This was worse than before. The youth grew crimson and clenched his fist with every appearance of a meditated assault. But he seemed to recollect himself presently and smothered the storm in a brutal curse muttered on my behalf, which, however, I took care not to notice. Unhappy in your conjectures, sir, observed my host. We neither of us have the privilege of owning your good fairy. Her mate is dead. I said she was my daughter-in-law, therefore she must have married my son. And this young man is not my son, assuredly. Heathcliff smiled again, as if it were rather too bold a jest to attribute the paternity of that bear to him. My name is Hareton Earnshaw, growled the other, and I'd counsel you to respect it. I've shown no disrespect, was my reply, laughing internally at the dignity with which he announced himself. He fixed his eye on me longer than I cared to return the stare, for fear I might be tempted either to box his ears or render my hilarity audible. I began to feel unmistakably out of place in that pleasant family circle. The dismal spiritual atmosphere overcame and more than neutralized the glowing physical comforts round me, and I resolved to be cautious how I ventured under those rafters a third time. The business of eating being concluded, and no one uttering a word of sociable conversation, I approached a window to examine the weather. A sorrowful sight I saw, dark night coming down prematurely, and sky and hills mingled in one bitter whirl of wind and suffocating snow. I don't think it possible for me to get home now without a guide, I could not help exclaiming. The roads will be buried already, and if they were bare, I could scarcely distinguish a foot in advance. Hareton, drive those dozen sheep into the barn porch. They'll be covered if left in the fold all night, and put a plank before them, said Heathcliff. How must I do? I continued with rising irritation. There was no reply to my question, and on looking round I saw only Joseph bringing in a pail of porridge for the dogs, and Mrs. Heathcliff leaning over the fire, diverting herself with burning a bundle of matches which had fallen from the chimney-piece as she restored the tea canister to its place. The former, when he had deposited his burden, took a critical survey of the room, and in cracked tones grated out, "Ah, wonder how ye can fashion to stand there I idleness and war, when all on un's gone out. But y'are not, and it's no use of talking. You'll never mend your ill ways, but go right to the divil, like your mother afore ye." I imagined for a moment that this piece of eloquence was addressed to me, and sufficiently enraged, stepped towards the aged rascal with an intention of kicking him to the door. Mrs. Heathcliff, however, checked me by her answer. "You scandalous old hypocrite," she replied. "Are you not afraid of being carried away bodily whenever you mention the devil's name? I warn you to refrain from provoking me, or I'll ask your abduction as a special favor. Stop. Look here, Joseph," she continued, taking a long, dark book from a shelf. "I'll show you how far I've progressed in the black art. I shall soon be competent to make a clear house of it. The red cow didn't die by chance, and your rheumatism can hardly be reckoned among providential visitations." "Oh, wicked, wicked," gasped the elder. "May the Lord deliver us from evil." "No, reprobate, you are a castaway. Be off, or I'll hurt you seriously. I'll have you all modeled in wax and clay, and the first who passes the limits I fix shall... I'll not say what he shall be done to, but you'll see. Go. I'm looking at you." The little witch put a mock malignity into her beautiful eyes, and Joseph, trembling with sincere horror, hurried out, praying and ejaculating, "Wicked," as he went. I thought her conduct must be prompted by a species of dreary fun, and now that we were alone, I endeavored to interest her in my distress. "Mrs. Heathcliff," I said earnestly, "you must excuse me for troubling you. I presume because, with that face, I'm sure you cannot help being good-hearted. Do point out some landmarks by which I may know my way home. I have no more idea how to get there than you would have how to get to London." "Take the road you came," she answered, ensconcing herself in a chair with a candle and the long book open before her. "It is brief advice, but as sound as I can give." "Then, if you hear of me being discovered dead in a bog or a pit full of snow, your conscience won't whisper that it is partly your fault?" "How so? I cannot escort you. They wouldn't let me go to the end of the garden wall." "You? I should be very sorry to ask you to cross the threshold for my convenience on such a night," I cried. "I want you to tell me my way, not to show it, or else to persuade Mr. Heathcliff to give me a guide." "Who? There is himself, Earnshaw, Zillah, Joseph, and I. Which would you have?" "Are there no boys at the farm?" "No, those are all." "Then it follows that I am compelled to stay." "That you must settle with your host. I have nothing to do with it." "I hope it will be a lesson to you to make no more rash journeys on these hills," cried Heathcliff's stern voice from the kitchen entrance. "As to staying here, I don't keep accommodations for visitors. You must share a bed with Hareton, or Joseph, if you do." "I can sleep on a chair in this room," I replied. "No, no. A stranger is a stranger, be he rich or poor. It will not suit me to permit anyone the range of the place while I am off guard," said the unmannerly wretch. With this insult, my patience was at an end. I uttered an expression of disgust and pushed past him into the yard, running against Earnshaw in my haste. It was so dark that I could not see the means of exit, and as I wandered around, I heard another specimen of their civil behavior amongst each other. At first, the young man appeared about to befriend me. "I'll go with him as far as the park," he said. "You'll go with him to hell!" exclaimed his master, or whatever relation he bore. And who is to look after the horses, eh? A man's life is of more consequence than one evening's neglect of the horses. Somebody must go, murmured Mrs. Heathcliff, more kindly than I expected. Not at your command, retorted Hareton. If you set store on him, you'd better be quiet. Then I hope his ghost will haunt you, and I hope Mr. Heathcliff will never get another tenant till the Grange is a ruin, she answered sharply. Hearken, hearken, shoe's cursing on 'em, muttered Joseph, towards whom I had been steering. He sat within earshot, milking the cows by the light of a lantern, which I seized unceremoniously, and calling out that I would send it back on the morrow, rushed to the nearest postern. Maister, maister, he's stealing the lantern, shouted the ancient, pursuing my retreat. Hey, Gnasher, hey, dog, hey, wolf, hold him, hold him. On opening the little door, 2 hairy monsters flew at my throat, bearing me down and extinguishing the light, while a mingled guffaw from Heathcliff and Hareton put the copestone on my rage and humiliation. Fortunately, the beasts seemed more bent on stretching their paws and yawning and flourishing their tails than devouring me alive. And they would suffer no resurrection, and I was forced to lie till their malignant masters pleased to deliver me. Then, hatless and trembling with wrath, I ordered the miscreants to let me out, on their peril to keep me 1 minute longer, with several incoherent threats of retaliation that, in their infinite depth of virulency, smacked of King Lear. The vehemence of my agitation brought on a copious bleeding at the nose, and still Heathcliff laughed, and still I scolded. I don't know what would have concluded the scene, had there not been one person at hand rather more rational than myself, and more benevolent than my entertainer. This was Zillah, the stout housewife, who at length issued forth to inquire about the nature of the uproar. She thought that some of them had been laying violent hands on me, and, not daring to attack her master, she turned her vocal artillery against the younger scoundrel. Well, Mr. Earnshaw, she cried, I wonder what you'll have against next. Are we going to murder folks on our very doorstones? I see this house will never do for me. Look at the poor lad, he's fair choking. Wisht, you mustn't go on so. Come in, and I'll cure that. There now, hold ye still. With these words, she suddenly splashed a pint of icy water down my neck and pulled me into the kitchen. Mr. Heathcliff followed, his accidental merriment expiring quickly in his habitual moroseness. I was sick exceedingly, and dizzy and faint, and thus compelled perforce to accept lodgings under his roof. He told Zillah to give me a glass of brandy and then passed on to the inner room, while she condoled with me on my sorry predicament, and having obeyed his orders, whereby I was somewhat revived, ushered me to bed. That concludes today's first reading from Wuthering Heights. The story has an interesting timeline. We're starting out, we'll get to it later. But yeah, thank you for joining me for today for the introduction or the preface to the second edition and also the first 2 chapters. I'll see you tomorrow for more Wuthering Heights. Bye.